Good morning. It is good for us to continue our conversation on the strategies for local churches to rethink evangelism. We've been spending some time together trying to talk about this subject because we want churches to be thinking both locally and globally about evangelism. There's a term that's been a term that has been coined called glocal, which captures that idea, but it's simply a combination of evangelism worldwide as well as evangelism in local communities. We have talked in some of our previous sessions about the importance of thinking about evangelism locally for the benefit of the local church, reaching its own community. But we want to shift gears a little bit today, and we're still talking about the church, but we want to think a little more globally today, and that's why I'm excited to have a good friend of mine, Tom Telford, here with us this morning. Tom has been involved in world missions for decades, literally. I don't know of another person who has had more contact with local churches and working with them to try to help them evaluate and establish solid missions strategies for their churches than Tom Telford. He has a very extensive background in a number of areas. We're not going to go too much into the testimony part today, Tom, but I do want to mention Tom's also an author. He's written a couple of books on the subject of missions. One is called All-Star Mission Churches, which talks about some of the churches that he has encountered in years past, which really have incredibly exciting and very powerful missions approaches. And then his other book is Missions in the 21st Century. And that is a book that is kind of geared to helping churches kind of assess where they are and where they need to be. So Tom is currently serving with United World Mission, which has also been affiliated with another organization you've been a part of called ACMC. What's ACMC stand for, Tom?
ACMC stand for, in the beginning when it was founded, it was the Association of Church Mission Committees. And today it is actually has gone under, but it ended up being the Association of Church Mission Committees and then Advancing Churches in Missions Commitment. And it was an organization that was geared to helping churches do a better job in missions.
I remember the years that I was a pastor, Tom, you were a part of helping our church, and some of the materials that came through that organization were of tremendous value to us. But let's move ahead with our subject matter this morning. You continue to be involved with a lot of churches, talking with a lot of people who are leaders in world missions. But you yourself have not been a quote-unquote full-time missionary in some foreign field. Your ministry has been pretty much stateside, working with churches who are sending agencies as well as caring for missionaries when they're home on assignment during that time. But there are some trends, very definite trends, that you and I have talked about that have kind of emerged, and we don't have time to talk about all of them today. I know that previously we had a list of about 10 that we had discussed, but let's just zero in on a couple of them today. So, kind of in rapid fire session, we're gonna touch on a few of them. One of them that you suggested was the area of inadequate views of missions. The churches have an inadequate view of missions. What do you mean by that phrase, Tom?
Well, I think most churches that I've gone to think mission's just another program in the church. And when you read the scripture from Genesis 12 all the way through Revelation, God's heart's for the world. And so people have kind of said, well, missions is something we do once a year. We bring in a mission speaker and we have a missions conference, and then we tuck missions away for another year. Plus, I think missions doesn't fit into the American dream. It's not popular to give your kids back to God and they may go overseas. I just think we've bought into the American dream, and so missions has become just a program, and that isn't how God intended it to be.
Would you be of the opinion more so than Tom that missions really should be woven into the fabric of the DNA of the church today?
Sure. Someone has said the church has a mission, mission has the church. And I think the vehicle God's chosen to reach the world is through the church. And but once again, if you go to the average church today, giving is 5%. The average church I've gone to over the years, most of them have never sent a missionary. And they just haven't bought into what God wants us to do. And so it should be an integral part of every ministry, the Sunday school, the choir. I was at a church, a good missions church, where I happened to be there on a Wednesday night and the choir was practicing. It sounded so good. But at the end of the time, they prayed for an unreached people group. See, that's buying into missions. Everybody in the church thinking about missions.
One of the other points that you made in your top 10 list was ignorance and apathy. But why do we see this ignorance level on the rise, that more and more people just seem to be ignorant about the bigger plan of God's global plan of reaching the world with the gospel? Why is that ignorance level at such a height that we find it today?
Well, I think there are a couple of reasons. One, I think someone said, as the pulpit goes, so goes the church. And I honestly think a lot of the problem lies within the pulpit. And of course, then you go back to, I think, because you can go to most Bible colleges and seminaries today, and there's not a big emphasis. In fact, we've taken the word missions out. It's now intercultural studies. And I think that's great, that part of it. But if you have pastors that go through a Bible college or seminary, never take a missions course, it's an elective in most Bible colleges and seminaries, how are they going to get up and preach on missions on Sunday morning and have a heart for missions? And so I think that's part of the problem. And just the word missions has negative connotations today. You go to most churches and the good ones are now using the word global instead of missions. Missions isn't in the Bible anywhere. And I think all those things lead together. It's just, we're living in a day and age when people become very selfish and what's in it for me? Well, that doesn't fit missions too well when God's asking us to give everything to Him. And I think the whole purpose of the church is outward. And we live in a country where everything's going this way. And God was always giving out of Himself. And I think missions is a harder sell all the time. So
if I hear you correctly, you think churches have become more ingrown than focused on reaching out? Yeah. Whether that's local or in a global context.
You go around to churches. Leith Anderson, in a book years ago, wrote a book on all different kinds of churches, and one of them was the supermarket church. It has something for everybody, and you pick and choose what you want. I'm convinced that missions has been left out of that whole package, or it's a very small package in most churches, and once again, something we do once a year.
Okay. Now, if that's then an accurate diagnosis, and there's no reason for us to not believe that that's true, and it's certainly the pattern that you've witnessed, given that observation, how do we fix that? And you talk a little bit about that under another point that you make about leadership. How do churches fix that absence of a missions emphasis in their churches?
Well, I think there's one way. In my own life, I served at a church as a missions pastor for a while. The pastor was a graduate of a well-known seminary, didn't have a heart for missions, and I thought one of the best ways to get him involved in missions was to send him overseas. And I joke about people, if you don't like your pastor, just send him one way. And I don't recommend that all the time, but it oftentimes works. Well, I laid out a trip for our pastor to go and visit nationals in other parts of the world, see what other people are doing. And I'll never forget it. When he came back, he was sold on missions. And I think many pastors haven't had exposure to other cultures. And the problem, they think it's a competition. The average pastor, he's thinking of building up his church here, and the missions people in the church want to send the best people overseas and a higher percentage of the budget. So I think getting some exposure to other cultures and getting exposure to see what's going on around the world changes a pastor's heart.
I know that had a big impact on me during the years that I served as a pastor. My church was very faithful in helping me on alternating years, they would send me to visit one of our missionaries on the field. And I know what that did for me to actually see the work of our missionaries and to understand some of the dynamics and the stresses that they were under as well. Let's move to another area. We've touched on this maybe a little bit. Competition with other priorities was another point that you highlighted. Maybe that falls under this idea of missions is just one more program in the church. Is that a quick summary, or is it bigger than that?
I think it's a number of things. Every church that I walk into, they do something well. And it's often music, and it's another church, it's some type of small group system, or it's another church it's going to do evangelism another way. And I think they don't have room for missions. Missions is a priority. And once again, I just think the major problem when you get into this is that someone has not understood the biblical basis of missions. I mean, in Genesis 12, we're blessed to be a blessing, and you can trace that all the way through. In fact, that statement's repeated in Galatians. And people have just bought into a certain part of the church. They've taken what they want. Some good friends of mine just called me, and they're looking for a church, and they say, we want a good music program. You can't do it all. And I think one of the things in the church today, when it comes to competition, I just think there are so many things out there, and you can't make everybody happy. But I think if we don't stick to the scripture, the church is going to become an entertainment place, which I think it's already become in a lot of churches. There's wars in churches on music, and there's small group systems, and they've got all kinds of competition. And I think missions just become another piece in the pie, when it should be the center of the pie, the core of the pie. And I think that's a harder and harder sell all the time. We want more money for ourselves, more money, another staff guy to do this. And so it just forces missions to the side all the time.
Now, I know that you interact with a lot of missionaries, a lot of missions leaders, a lot of mission organizations or mission boards. Call them whatever terminology we choose. But there are some new trends that we're seeing that are very effective in some parts of the world. We're seeing things such as BAM, and some people may not know what BAM is. That's business as mission. How do you think something like that fits into today's culture?
Well, I think it fits in very, very well. There's a couple reasons why BAM it will probably be very successful. One is that in most parts of the world, you can't send missionaries in. In fact, we have 2 billion people who never had a chance to hear the gospel. You can't get a visa to go into most of those countries. But they want some skills that we have. So the idea of BAM is going and setting up businesses in other parts of the world and reaching people for the gospel through that. And I think that'll be very successful. Paul did it years ago. And more people are buying into BAM as a way to reach people. For years in the church, we asked the businessmen, give us money for missions. Now we're asking, use your expertise for mission. And this is taking off. Most mission agencies have a BAM department. Some mission agencies today have already started and set up their own little business enterprise with their own separate tax thing and all of that. But it opens up missions to a whole lot more people, getting more and more people involved. And when you think about it, I think good churches will try and get people from the pews to get personally involved, and that's the secret to getting people excited about missions, getting them some kind of hands-on experience. And here with BAM, we open up a whole wave of people that we have never used before. And the third world countries want what we have, and we have men sitting in our churches that can go and do that. And by the way, this is very cost effective, because most of these men, they're not going to go on the missions budget. They're going to go and do this on their own, and we're seeing this starting to happen more and more. And most mission agencies have a BAM department today.
But it's really not the desire to get more money that motivates them. It's the gospel that's motivating them to be able to use their business expertise in another part of the world. And one of the things that I've noticed is that often in those BAM type of programs, they're employing nationals, it helps the economy in those countries, and it also builds relationships with those employees where they have a chance to live out the gospel, to show the gospel to those people, and then eventually at times to be able to share the gospel with those. And in a lot of the countries that are closed, this is a tremendous avenue worth considering.
Another term for this would be marketplace ministry. The first one I bumped onto years ago when this first started was a man who got the contract in America for some type of TV receiver, and he started a company making those in China. And within 2 to 3 churches, he had led 150 people to Christ and started 2 or 3 cell churches. I think that's the model, and it's reaching people with the gospel.
Tom, another area that again we hear a lot about today are partnerships with nationals in other countries. So a church in the United States, for example, would partnership with a ministry organization that's on the ground, and they would take advantage of the indigenous people. I don't mean take advantage in a negative way, but they would utilize the fact that these are individuals who already speak the language, they know the culture, they live on much less, their immediate results, and more mission agencies are simply coming alongside of them, not to take over or take control, but to come alongside to be able to say, how can we work with you? How can we help you? This partnering with nationals, what's your take on that trend that we see?
Well, it just seems to me to make more common sense. The national already has the language, he knows the culture, and all we need to do is come alongside them. And so more and more mission agencies are coming alongside groups overseas. You already have a number of agencies already established in these countries, and so all they need is some of our expertise in different ways. I think the other thing you see along this line is most mission agencies now have multinational teams. I taught at a candidate school 3 weeks ago where in that room were 20 people. 5 were from Spanish countries, 2 or 3 were from Muslim countries, somebody from Asia. And a team in those countries are made up of 5 different nationalities. I just think that makes sense. I'm not saying it's going to be easy because we all have so many differences, but that's the wave of the future. And in a lot of these countries, all we need to do is go and train people. That's why I think teaching nationals in other countries, building them up in the scriptures and getting to understand them and working with them. But this is where it's going to happen. Most of these countries are producing 10 to 15 to 20 missionaries every one we are. In fact, for the last 10 years in America, we've stayed level with how many missionaries we sent because some are retiring and new ones going out, just replace them. But in other parts of the world, Korea, for example, you can go to some of these countries that have far more missionaries than we do. And shouldn't we be doing this all together?
We're moving down here toward the end of our time, but I want to pick up, before we wrap up here this morning, I want to pick up on your book that you wrote on the all-star churches. Some of these churches that you came across who are just doing some very unique things. You'd probably call some of them really leaders in the area of missions today, of what churches can do. So we want to give a realistic perspective, which I think we have so far, but let's finish on an optimistic perspective and say what are some exciting things, and it may be some churches that you mentioned in the book or some other churches that you've come across in more recent years. What are some of the exciting things that you see churches doing that might spark interest or an idea for some other churches that might be tuning into this video?
I think one of the most exciting churches in there is Wheaton Bible Church is in Chicago. It's in the Wheaton area, and they actually have a Sunday school class on Sunday morning for Muslims. They've got that many Muslims coming to their church. I mean, that's unheard of. But they decided, because they found in a certain part of Chicago, not far from the church, there was high-rise apartment house. So they invested in that apartment house, and they are reaching Muslims right here, and Muslims are being won to Christ right here in Wheaton, the Wheaton area. And I think that's exciting, reaching to the community. God's brought the mission field to us. Someone said, because we didn't respond and go, he's brought them here. And I think we see more and more churches taking advantage of that, finding out what cultures live near them. And actually, some of them have brought missionaries home to reach them. The guy that teaches the Muslim class in Wheaton Bible Church is a former missionary that was reaching Muslims. Now he's reaching more right here. And by the way, when most of these cultures, these people from other cultures are brought out of their own culture, they're far more open to the gospel. Or I was just talking to someone recently. I met a guy who's just started an organization called Move In, and he's picked high-rise apartment houses that are occupied by Muslims, Hindus, or Buddhists, and he's asking Christians to move in them and just keep their job and just live their life in front of them. He's already got over 70 couples doing this in Toronto, Minneapolis. There's a whole lot of Somalians living. Actually, 1,800 Somalians live in a big apartment house, and he's got people moving in there and just living their life in front of them. I think that's missions. That's when everybody in the church buys into mission. It's everybody's job. I think of the saying I saw outside of a church that is doing a great job in evangelism. It said, "You catch them, we'll clean them." I like that idea. Just you go in and live your life, you're going to have a chance to reach them. You don't have to hit them over the head with the gospel. Just live your life in front of them. And I think that's what the scripture's all about. And I see a number of churches that have bought into making missions the fabric of the church. That's why we're here. And the whole outward concept instead of inward. And it's exciting. They have all the other good programs. They're reaching their kids. They're doing training. But they made the fabric of the churches to be everybody's focused in reaching outward. And I think that's what makes the church exciting in missions. And I think of a couple of other models, a church in New England that has just decided that they would reach the ethnic people near where they are. And so they decided to hold dinners for them. They did all kinds of things like that. The stories come out of that. They hold a dinner. They bring people from MIT, 2 or 3 different big schools, and just have food for them, and then they go into people's homes. They offer them the homes. And most of these international students, which we now have almost 1 million in this country, 2 things they're looking for is find out something about what people believe and learn something about our history. And I heard the one woman tell a story in that church of hosting a Chinese student from MIT just over a short period of time, came to the meeting for the dinner, stayed in their home, went to church with them on Sunday morning, and coming home from church, he said he wanted to prepare a meal for the family. And he prepared a Chinese meal, and she said, "Our children who don't like rice were upset." She said, but he taught them how to use chopsticks, and he won them over. Within a month, he phoned that house and said, "I love being in your home. Could I come and live with you for the next 2 years?" They took that kid in. And the woman, this is now 10 years old, told me the story of those kids on their vacation were given a trip to go back with this kid when he went back to China. The kid got saved, and her children are now thinking about missions. See, I think that's buying in. See, those people gave up a room in their home. And look what happened as a result of that. So I think the whole outward focus of the church has to be increased in America.
Tom, we've all through this series, we've kept talking about Acts 1:8 as being kind of a centerpiece for these conversations, where we know in Acts 1:8 that there was this impacting of the gospel going forward in kind of concentric circles in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and the uttermost parts of the world. The reality is, and you've said it again today, and some others have mentioned this same trend, today we see the door coming that we see people coming to our doorstep. We are home to many people, whether they're immigrants or students or whatever the case may be, but they're coming here to our doorstep, and there is a challenge to the church to reach out to them. But that doesn't mean that we just give up on what we've called traditional missions, but who we send and where we send them, and the way that they're engaged in ministry in some other context in the uttermost part of the world is going to look very differently, perhaps, than it did a generation ago. But it seems like there's more emphasis and with this we'll close. It seems like there's more emphasis on the entire church being the missionary instead of just a select few who we identify from our churches as being the missionaries who we want to send to some other part of the world. Would you agree or disagree with that
I
concept?
agree 100% with that. I think the idea is if we get the whole church involved in missions, and then the best of those people in missions are the ones we send cross-culturally, but the whole church doing missions. And until we get to that point, missions isn't exciting. Until we send some of our own people and until we reach out to the community here. Nothing is more exciting than seeing people won to Christ, and yet we don't see that happen in our own church as much. And I don't think it's going to be one in the church, it'll be one outside the church by people excited and living their life in front of people, and people will come and ask them about, how can I go back to that little saying I said, you catch them, he'll clean them. I'm convinced more and more that missions is the job of the whole church. The whole church taking the whole gospel to the whole world is a statement that's made. I believe that.
Well, it seems that that's pretty biblical, because when you go back to the church of Antioch in the New Testament, when they got ready to send out missionaries, the first two that they sent were Paul and Barnabas. And the two who had been most influential, those who had been the teachers, those who had been the equippers and building up the church at Antioch, were the ones that now the spiritual leaders of the church of Antioch said, we're sending you to the uttermost parts of the world. And we've kind of moved away from that model. So it does give us something to rethink evangelism as we are strategizing for how we are going to engage our world in the future, both locally and globally. Hope that this made you think a little bit about what your church is doing in the area of missions. Again, our guest has been Tom Telford. Tom, thanks for sharing your thoughts and your expertise and insights with us today.
Thank you.
Thanks.